Hello, Social 20, and welcome back. Last lesson, we looked at the definition of nationalism and we looked at different perspectives. In today's class, we are going to learn about the understandings of nation, what makes up different nations, as well as the definition of both a nation and a nation state. Here's our lesson objectives. And what we're going to do first is start by looking at a little bit of a review. So when we looked at Social Studies 20, you looked at an entire first unit on identity. So there were three basics to identity. We look at personal identity, the things that make you unique, your individual talents and skills and interests, and that is a large piece of your identity. However, there are two other parts that also involve others. So the collective identity are who you are in relation to others. So usually we think about it, what specific groups do you belong to? Things like Girl Guides or soccer teams or bands that you're part of. And when we think about our collective identity, even larger in relation to a collective identity is a national identity. So that's who you are in relationship to a large collective. It can be perhaps your country. It can be a country that you identify as a part of, although you don't live there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your national identity is only where you were born and where you're from. So today we're going to look at some different nations and what makes up a nation, and we're going to relate that back to how it can shape our identity and different aspects of nation. When we start to look at the different understandings of nation, first we need to have a really clear understanding about what a nation is. A nation is actually surprisingly not a country. A nation is different than a country, and we don't use those terms interchangeably in Social 20. When we have conversations with people, they often use the word nation to relate to a country, but in this course, a nation state is different than a nation. So, when we look at the term nation, in the relationship to different nations in this course, we think about it as a group of people rather than a country. It can even be a mindset. It can be people who have things in common, but they don't have to live in the same place. So it is mainly used to think about it as people who share perhaps a culture, a history, a language, but really it's people who share a similar worldview and ideas about themselves. So they can actually be in different countries at the same time, but you belong to the same nation. So the two characteristics that we like to think of nation for Social 20 are they are collectively belong to a group and they share a similar world view. So there are many different ways that nations can develop. So when we think about perhaps a nation state, we think about how it has developed through two ways. Traditionally, a group of people shared something in common. All throughout history, we had groups of people who shared the same ethnicity, the same ethnic background. The ancestry and the history was very similar. And they had borders that were drawn around their country, and they had a lot of similar cultural values and beliefs. And then some of them start to kind of have this sense of belonging, and they identify themselves as part of that nation. And then they start to form rules around what are the things that they're going to believe in that country. So when we think about traditionally how nations have developed, it was through a shared ethnicity. But when we think about more modern nations and people have more choice in the groups and worldviews that they belong in, we kind of think to themselves, perhaps it's more of a sense of belonging. And then they can identify themselves with different groups in that nation. So when we think about the evolution of nations, we start with having people. So when we have different nations, we're going to explore all of these different types of nation next. And they have things in common. So it could be a language, it could be a shared culture, it could be a shared political situation. And then in order to form a country, you also need some sort of administrative body. You need a government, you need somebody who is elected or in control, and you need a legal entity that is actually capable of producing laws and making rules for that country. So you need a group of people that have some shared characteristics and then an administrative body. We put those two together and then we have what we call a nation state. A nation state is what we would call interchangeably a country. Okay, so a nation state needs to have these characteristics of a defined territory and a government, and they also have a collective sense of a group. Okay, so 3 ways historically nation states have come to existence. 1, through a revolution. So there has been a system in place, and a revolution is when things have drastically changed, usually for the better. They can also be formed through succession. So as you know, Canada was formed through the separation as a colony of Britain. And we call that succession. It was fairly peaceful. Revolutions tend to not be very peaceful. Successions can or can't be peaceful. And the last way is through unification. So different parts, let's say you have people with perhaps a shared ethnicity and they are in different parts, surrounded by borders of different countries, they can come together and they unify to form one large nation state. Those have historically been the 3 ways that we have formed a nation state, through both a nation and a state coming together. Okay, so we are going to now look through all of the understandings of nation, and we're going to describe them in detail. None of these words should be new. They should all be things that you have seen before. And we're going to try to understand how do people put themselves into a sense of belonging with others and through the nation, okay, that they belong to. So the first one is called a linguistic nation. Pretty easy. Linguistic is just another name for language. If you go and study languages in university, they call it linguistics, and it's really just the common language that people share. So they don't have to be in the same area. They just share a sense of belonging because they have a sense of shared communication. If you've ever traveled, you can understand how difficult it is to connect or not connect because people can't actually express themselves. So when you're traveling somewhere and you find someone who speaks the same language as you, you feel that sense of connection and relief almost, because now you have some sense of a shared connection to them. In Canada, we have a very strong linguistic nation in our Francophone population, of course. So Francophones, they're sharing a language and a culture typically across Canada. And we also, as a country, are part of an organization called La Francophonie, which you're going to learn about later in this course, that promotes this culture. And a large part of it is the preservation of language. So we are, of course, multilinguistic. We are bilingual in our country, and that means that we have to have a set amount of French on our labels, on our signs, and our street signs. And in Quebec specifically, they have very specific laws to make sure that their language is preserved, to encourage that sense of community amongst their citizens. The next nation we're going to look at, it's not about language, it's about ethnicity, and it's an ethnic nation. So when we think about the traditional way that nation states have been formed, they were formed through a common ethnicity, a shared race, culture, or linguistic characteristic, and then they kind of formed borders around people who shared those similarities. So an ethnic nation was very much the traditional form of how we form nation states, okay? It's often expressed by participating in certain community associations or celebrations that recognize and strengthen the aspects of that ethnicity. Not always. Somebody can be born into a certain ethnicity, but not necessarily celebrate or recognize all of the parts of it, or somebody can choose to as well. Ethnic nations have a lot of different aspects to them, including a common bond and a heritage and a history that brings people together to have that sense of belonging within that nation. However, historically, ethnic nations have created a sense of, if you are different for us, that could be a problem, and it has led to things like conflicts and world wars and countries taking over from others, including racism and intolerance. And so having the shared sense of ethnicity can be a very strong sense of belonging, but it can also create divisions. The next nation we're going to look at is cultural nation. And this is really seen as more the expression. And it's a shared sense of a way of life, if you will. So ethnicity can be just simple genetics. But in culture, we're thinking about it in the expression and the way of life and how these traditions are carried out. So cultural nation, this here is an expression, I believe that these are New Zealand, And they're doing kind of something that is very culturally important to them before they start a tournament. They do the haka dance, and it's that expression of their cultural nation. Throughout Canada, we have all kinds of cultural nations. They can be ones people choose to belong to. Even things like sports teams are considered a culture. So Edmonton Oilers, Calgary Flames, they have a large following that's almost a whole culture to it. Okay. And so when we think about the expression of cultural nation, it can be things like First Nations. They have a shared way of life. It can be about sports teams, so people can opt in or out of how they express their cultural nationhood. The Latino culture is celebrated with Expo Latino Festival, and we have a lot of those examples. The next one we're going to look at is a religious nation, so a shared religious belief. This is an important understanding of nation because it doesn't require people to be near each other. The sense of belonging to a certain religion tends to carry out pretty consistently no matter where somebody is in the world, and it creates that very deep sense of unity. So they know perhaps they don't speak the same language linguistically, but maybe they go into a mosque or a church in another country and they can understand and have that common sense of belonging and community because they follow the same religious practices. So a lot of common ones would be like Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhism, Hindu, Sikh, and they have a large sense of unity among the different groups within a religion. Geographic nation is exactly as it sounds. So it is a defining sense of nationhood by a physical feature. We have a large geography in Canada, so the people who are living in the Maritimes on beaches and lakes have a very different sense of that geographic unity than we do out here, perhaps in Alberta, where we've got farms and we've got mountains, and we don't have the same sense, perhaps, of relationship to the environment. So when we see the relationship of geographic nations to people, it can really depend on, how isolated they are in relationship to the environment. So people who live on an island like Japan, Hawaii, they have a very different sense of that unity to nature, and a lot of times it is based on isolation. Your textbook specifically talks about Easter Island and how their isolation, very interesting place. It's off of the coast in South America there, off of Chile. And they have the large statues with the men with those faces. And it's led to a very unique place. And mainly it is because of their geography. They're isolated. And it's formed a large part of their identity. Spiritual nation is not the same as religion. So religion tends to be about the practices, and spirituality tends to be about the beliefs that can be very individual to somebody. It's not as ritualized in a lot of situations. Sometimes it is. So it's easier to understand in that it can be really something that somebody chooses, and how their connection to things like the land or their culture can be shaped by spirituality. So spiritual connections through the land can unite people. Things like stories and myths and celebrations. Our First Nations culture typically has a very strong spiritual sense of community. So they have a representation of spirituality through the land, through the trees, through the animals. They see an eagle. It represents, a relative that is bringing you a message. And they have this sense, and that will shape their entire way of life. And that's through their spiritual and their connections as a spiritual nation. An example of that would be our Siksika Nation. They have a lot of spiritual connections in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, and a lot of their practices around their spirituality as well. So a political nation, it can be a few things. It can be control of yourself. So we talk about Tibet and how they kind of separated themselves and set themselves up and recognized their own political independence, but also belonging to a political nation can be to what someone's political beliefs are. So we are not as politicized here in Canada as some other countries. We have lots of groups people belong to. The main ones would be Liberals and NDP and Conservatives. And then they kind of identify themselves with that group. And they have a shared sense of belief with people who are also part of that political nation. We have more of a divide in other countries. The United States has groups like the Democrats and Republicans, and that is a very strong sense of unity for either side, for people who belong to either one of those groups. The example here is that China did take over control of Tibet in 1949. They were already their own nation. However, currently Tibet's government is in exile, and they do not identify as themselves under China's control. They say, no, politically, we have decided that we're going to manage ourselves. We do not associate with taking their political stance, and they are still underneath that belief, and that's a sense of political nation. Okay, so something to think about. We reviewed a lot of different groups and nations that people can identify with. What about more casual ones? When we think about things like a fast food nation or a gaming nation, that's a really big one. Is that a cultural nation? Is gaming nation? There is a whole culture to it. There's a whole sense of rituals and habits and trends that are going along with some of the emergence of some of these cultures. And is that enough to call it a culture? Does it have to be traditionally rooted in some ethnicity or some historic sense of, display? Or is it enough to say that I belong to, a gaming nature, or I am a big part of the gaming community? So it's really something to think about. Are these examples of a cultural nation? And so after we examine all of the different nations that people can identify with, there are often times when a person's loyalties are tested. So you might identify, let's say, with more than one understanding of these nations. For example, if I have been born somewhere else and then I come to Canada, I would still like to hold on to some of my traditions, let's say. But what if I feel that kind of conflict in that maybe I am not giving myself enough to my new country, or have I given up on my old country? And there can be a lot of circumstances when loyalties conflict. And of course, it is somebody's personal choice to choose, how do we reconcile these conflicting loyalties? And can I belong to more than one? And how? And oftentimes we belong to a large amount of those. But there are some situations where, of course, it can lead us with a very complex understanding of who we are. And I do support my country. Do I support all the things they do? Would I be willing to go into a war to fight for my country? There are a lot of loyalties that come up and can conflict. And so what we're going to look at later in the course is, how do people decide? There's usually about 3 ways that people decide how to choose. And usually it can be, do I choose one? Do I ignore them? So we're going to have to understand that sometimes people are going to have different sense of understandings, and I want to belong to this nation, but there's some things that I can't accept from this other one, and it can lead to a really complex sense of identity.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.